Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of In the Studio with Darius Fentress. I'm so glad that you guys are here today, and I'm just excited about today's episode. But before we get into it, I want to make sure that you guys go and support this channel. You can go on YouTube, you could go on Apple Music, Apple Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel so I can continue to bring you guys amazing content. Today's guest is an amazing mentor from afar from me. He has worked on so many amazing projects. He's a 7-time Grammy award-winning producer, audio engineer, mixing engineer. He's worked on some of the biggest albums ever in a multitude of different genres. So I want you guys to welcome my special guest today, John Jaszcz. John, how are you, man?
I'm doing great.
I want to thank you for being on here. I know you're a busy man. So
my pleasure.
I just appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, so John, you have been in this industry for a long time, and there's a lot of ground we could cover. And I just want to know from you, like, when did it start for you? When did the bug of audio engineering hit you? How did that start?
Well, it started before my involvement with audio engineering. Of course, it started with music. It's always about the music. And when I was a little kid, I was probably 11 years old when the Beatles came on TV on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I went, whoa, I want to do that. That's what I want to do. I want to have something to do with that. And only problem was at the time, all I played was an accordion. I didn't play guitar. I was 11 and I'd been playing accordion for like 5 years since I was little kid. I was still a little kid. And I said, man, I want to be involved in this music thing because the Beatles are just unbelievable. So, time passes, and I wrote my first song on an accordion, by the way.
Wow.
It wasn't a good song, but then I by the time I was 12 or 13, I started playing guitar. 12 years old, and then high school comes around, and I played in a rock band from the time I was 14 until I was about 24, and realized I was never going to be Paul McCartney, and so I wanted to, we had always recorded a little bit in my band. In fact, the biggest bug I ever had was when I went with my band to a recording studio and we recorded, and I was just amazed with the technology. This is 1974. And
okay.
I was in the studio, I played the parts, and sang and all that, and then came in the control room, and I was just fascinated with what was going on between the producer and the engineer. And I was standing behind the engineer, and I was watching him, and I was thinking, why don't you pan my guitar over here? Like I'm thinking all these. I didn't say anything because I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about recording, but I just kept my mouth shut. And they did the record. And actually, in retrospect, I listened to it years later. The guy was a great recording engineer, really. And I always remember that the way his demeanor during the recording session was so professional. And what he did was amazing for 1974 because we were recording on 8-track. And it really sounded good, and especially hearing it years later. So anyways, I got this bug. After that, I started listening to records differently, and I'd see who's the producer, who's the engineer. It took a while, 2 or 3 years before I started really zoning in on, it's about the engineer. It's about the producer. And so I went out and bought a 4-track Tascam tape recorder, which is full reel to reel. And then a buddy of mine also had another 4-track. And we didn't even know it at the time, but we never had the knowledge like they have today, where you can go on YouTube and find out how people recorded. But that's how the Beatles recorded. They recorded on 4-track, then they bounced to another 4-track, and they went back and forth. And we were just doing it because that was the only way we could figure out how to make a record or a demo. And so we recorded on the 4-track, bounced it back and forth. I had this little studio in my basement, put up the egg cartons on the wall, the whole.
Yeah.
It didn't even have a reverb unit. In fact, I thought, hey, if I put a microphone in the furnace and a speaker, and it rings, that might be the reverb. So I had no idea what I was doing, but we got reverb by doing that. Anyways, awesome. Time goes on, and I'm making all these mistakes. And I'm reading. I had a book called Modern Recording Techniques. I found this book, and I would read it and learn how to record. And during this period, so we're talking 1978-ish, I think it was. Yeah, it would have been 1978. So from 74, I recorded my first session to 1978. I'm learning all this stuff. I find out that there's recording classes at a recording studio in Detroit, because that's where I grew up. And so I go take this class, and it was just an eye-opener. I'm going, oh, wow, this is kind of what I've been doing, but this is way better. They're teaching me all about the microphones and how they work, and, omni, cardioid, everything. And they teach us about tape machines and how to align them. And at that time, I was like, okay, this 4-track thing at home is not working. I'm in a real recording studio right now. I'm getting a job there. That's what I said to him. I said to myself, nice. I'm going to work in this recording studio. And so I would do this class, and then I would bug the instructor, whose name was Fred Munch, by the way. And I'd bug him, hey, are you going to do a recording session tonight after this? And he'd go, yeah. Can I come? Yeah. So I would stay after class and do the session. I'd be the assistant, or wasn't really an assistant because I didn't really know everything to do, But anyways, I kept doing that with this instructor, and finally the instructor told the studio owner about me. He said, hey, this guy, he's learned a lot in the class, but he knows a lot because he was in a band and he'd been recording on his own. You should hire him. So that's what happened. And so in end of 1978, I was asked to become basically a paid intern at this recording studio. Wow. And it was called The Disc. And the owner of the studio was a guy named Bob Dennis. And the chief engineer was a guy named Greg Riley. And both of those guys, Bob Dennis was the mastering engineer for Motown. He mastered 31 million seller records for Motown. And after Motown left Detroit, he started working for Holland Dozier Holland. They had a studio. Actually, it was kind of simultaneously. Motown was still there. Holland Dozier Holland. He switched over to Holland Dozier Holland. They built a studio. He built a studio with a guy named Greg Riley, and then they recorded Holland Dozier Holland for several years, but then Holland Dozier Holland decided to go to California, also followed Motown. Mm-hmm. So, but Holland Dozier Holland gave them all the gear so they could continue with a recording studio. And that's a simplified version of what really happened. But so the point is that I was mentored by Motown guys and Holland Dozier Holland guys. And it was a pretty incredible experience right from the beginning, because we were able to have, a 24-track machine, a 16-track machine, boatloads of microphones. We had full percussion instruments, drums, tambourines, timbales, everything was there in the recording studio. They even had glockenspiels and vibraphones. It was amazing. It was like a real recording studio. So with that said, it was a dream come true. Go ahead.
What part of town was that studio in?
It was on the east side of Detroit. The city was actually called East Detroit, but it really wasn't part of Detroit. It was a northern suburb of Detroit.
Okay.
And so subsequently, or over time, we started recording Parliament Funkadelic there. Parliament recorded at United Sound, the disc, and another studio called the Sound Suite. Because they had all these musicians. George doesn't just have like 3 or 4 guys. If you've ever seen a Funkadelic concert, possibly, there's usually like 30 people on stage.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so there were all these different musicians, and so in order to keep the funk machine going, they would utilize all the studios in Detroit. But at one point, our studio became the main focal point of his recordings, and we literally recorded 24 hours a day. We had sets of 3 engineers working around the clock, just recording P-Funk. And they had like 3 different groups of musicians that would come in and record, from say 10 o'clock in the morning till 6, and then from 6 to midnight, and from midnight to 6 a.m. or 8 a.m. or whatever. And I was fortunate enough for a year, most of my recording I did was with Bootsy Collins. So we just recorded track after track after track, because he was a workaholic, and he would just work all the time. We'd start a track in the morning, and by 6 or 7 at night, we'd have all the vocals done, and then move on to another song the next day. And not probably only, I don't know, who knows, for a year we must have recorded 100 songs. Probably only 10 of them went on a record, maybe 20, because some of them went on his record, some of them would go on a Parliament record, some would go on a Funkadelic record. Mm-hmm. And the only difference between Parliament and Funkadelic was that Funkadelic was all about guitars, and Parliament had horns and strings on it. That was the only difference. Right. It was all the same musicians.
Yeah. Man.
So that's what we did. Amazing. Every day. Wow. It was the funk sessions. And
what was that like for you? Just because you're new in this industry, you're learning. How did that experience of working with a group like that develop your skills? Because I'm sure you had to be on top of your toes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, so my background was mostly rock music, right? So Led Zeppelin and all that stuff, right? But I grew up listening to Motown. But once I started working with them, it was all about the groove, obviously, with P-Funk. And I learned about the groove, and then I learned how to adapt to that and record the best way possible to achieve their groove. We experimented with, how to record the drums and all that sort of stuff. I can't tell you everything we did, but first we started recording in a drum booth, and then one day I said, "Hey, why don't we pull the drums out in the room? They'll sound better if they're open," and things like that. And then we developed different techniques of recording, and there were no bounds. Like, anytime somebody wanted to experiment, we just did it. Why don't we put a speaker on the piano, and we'll just hold down a chord and we'll run that through. We just did crazy stuff. We did all kinds of crazy stuff, and there was nothing that you didn't want to try, because it was all about making the best record. And if it failed, you went, "Oh, well, we spent an hour doing that. We'll move on to something else." It doesn't matter. Wow. So they pushed, the guys, like Bootsy and George and everything. They pushed the bounds, and you really did have to be on top of your game. In fact, the thing that was the scariest about recording back then was punching in, because when you were dealing with tape, if you accidentally erase something, you're in trouble.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, and the other thing about punching in was, in the day, was the actual punch in time. There was a lag time from when you pressed record until it actually went into record. There was a slight lag time. So you always had to anticipate the punch.
Yeah.
You think it'd be right on the one, but you'd have to go, 1, 2, 3, 4, right before the one, and not the end of one or anything. I mean, it had to be like just 10 milliseconds before the one.
Wow.
And so that was the scariest part. In fact, I'll never forget when. So that's 1978 to 82 or 83, right? For that whole period, and of course, analog stayed around for a long time. And
Yeah.
what I won't forget is back starting in about 2000 when I actually started using Pro Tools and realized I couldn't erase anything because you could just punch in and pull it back.
Right.
I was so relieved. It was like it took all that anxiety out of you about recording. Up until that point, you could
Right.
you could erase things. Even when they had the different digital recording tools that came out at the time, which they're escaping me right now. But anyways,
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about, like the Tascam MX-24,
things like that. Yeah, you could
Yeah.
still accidentally erase things,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was a total relief. We lived with that for years, from the time I started recording until around 1999, 2000. And that's when Pro Tools started really picking up. It probably started in 98. But when it first came out, as an engineer, there were actually younger guys that ran the computers. And all we did was set up the sounds. And then we might punch in, then we started punching in. But the young guys, they were the only ones that knew about computers. We were the old guys already. Even though I was only like 44 years old,
Right.
we were the old guys already. But then eventually I had to learn Pro Tools, because
Yeah.
and that was a whole epiphany of it's either you learn Pro Tools or you're left behind. And so it's been probably 26 years of operating Pro Tools or so, But before that, it was
It
was the
a lot of pressure.
analog and digital world. It was pressure. It was definitely pressure.
Yeah. So at what point did you move over to working out of Studio A in Dearborn?
Okay. Well, there's a little bit before that. Before I got to Studio A, I was working at a studio called RMJ.
RMJ, yes.
RMJ
absolutely.
on 6 Mile in Detroit. And we were doing all sorts of stuff over there. So I was kind of, I had to leave the disc and become independent. It was probably after I did a Roger album, and it was fairly successful. And then people started hiring me to mix and to track and stuff. And I wasn't making enough money there. And so I would work there and at other studios and get paid extra as an engineer.
Okay.
I could set up a rate. Because we made, basically when I started, we made nothing. Like we were working for way less than what people make at McDonald's now.
Oh, wow.
And so anyways, I became kind of independent, and I would work between the disc and RMJ and United Sound. And, but this goes to commissioned actually. So I'm at RMJ Studios, and I'd been recording different artists over there. A guy named RJ's Latest Arrival, and the studio manager liked all the stuff I was doing. And so there was another engineer that worked out of the studio named Warren Woods. And he was working with commissioned. And I would see him as I was walking out the door. I'd see the guys coming in, he was walking out, and I'd be walking out the door doing from another session, and then they would work. And apparently at some point, Warren decided to move to California.
Oh, wow.
And so the studio manager said, "Hey, would you like to work with these guys, Fred Hammond and Michael Brooks, and commissioned?" I said, "Sure." "Do they pay?" "No." I'm kidding. No. So actually at that time, though, I would actually get paid by the studio. But so I can't totally recall if Warren had mixed some of the songs already or not. He may have. And so I took over for Warren, and I started mixing the first album by commission.
Okay. That's what I was going to ask. Was it the first album?
It was the very first album.
Okay.
And I'd have to go back and look and see if Warren I can't remember. But I know if he did, he may have mixed a couple, and then I mixed the rest of it. And it was really a fun experience working with Fred and Michael. And but it was like a situation where they didn't really know me that well. We're in the studio and we worked together, because back then you didn't take a day or two to mix a song. You mixed like 2 songs a day.
Wow.
I think probably that whole thing lasted maybe 5 days or something, 6 days or something. It was a short period of time,
to mix the whole record.
But yeah, depending on whether I mixed the whole record or if Warren did, I can't remember.
Okay.
But it was at least 5 or 6 songs, and went really fast. And there's one little story that's kind of funny. So Fred or Michael every now and then would say, "Hey, can you brighten up the snare or the vocal or something?" And so back then I'm working on a console. So the way when you worked on a console and you wanted to brighten something up, you would crank up the gain, like 6 dB, and then you would move the frequency around and decide which frequency do I like the most, and then you'd back it off, right?
Right.
And so I'll never forget this. So I would always do that, and I'd back it off, but it would still be brighter than it was, right? I adjusted it. But Michael and Fred, they never said it at that moment when I did it. They thought, he's just turning it up and turning it back down. And so the next day they said, "Hey, John, when we ask you to turn something up, like change the EQ on something, we really appreciate it if you actually moved it and didn't turn it back to where it was." And I went, "Fred, Michael, I'm not doing that. Watch." And I showed them, and they're going, "Oh, I didn't understand what you were doing." And that was the first time that we had trust, because there's a lot of that in, especially when you're working one-on-one with people, it's all about trust, and that you're and especially back then, they didn't really understand technology. Today Fred can probably run Pro Tools better than I can. Who knows? But back then, the guy in the room that knew the technology was me or whoever was engineering, and the artists and producers didn't know much about it other than that was a console, and they didn't know, what it did. So you had to gain an artist's trust, and so explaining, I realized then that sometimes you have to explain things to people in order to gain their trust. Even when you're today, you still have to say, "Well, I'm doing this and I'm doing this for this reason. And if it doesn't work, we can change it back, or we can go farther, we can do whatever. How do you perceive this now? Let's take it a step further, or let's go back to where we were, So you have to explain what you're doing sometimes, and it's all about communication.
Right. You talk about that trust. They had a philosophy where they wanted the background vocals to be present forward in the mix. How did you adapt to what they wanted? Because I know that was different.
No, well, okay. So on the first record, it probably, I guess psychologically, I did have to adapt. But by the time I got to the second record, I recorded every single thing that we did.
Okay.
And so it was understood. These weren't background vocals. This is commissioned. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it in the beginning, maybe they may have asked me to push up the vocals or something or whatever the backgrounds. But once we started recording, when I went to Studio A, which I'll explain how we got to Studio A. Okay. By that point, once we were at Studio A, I recorded every single note. I cut the drums, I cut the bass, cut keys, everything, and we recorded all the vocals. And we had a process. We created a process of recording those vocals the way they were, starting on the second album. And, but to go back to how I met, I'll never forget this. So we had done that first album. And then like a year goes by, I don't hear anything from him, but I happened to be over. I was going over to United Sound for some reason, and I was in the parking lot, and Fred and Michael were coming out of the studio. And by this time I actually had moved to Studio A from RMJ to Studio A, because Eric Morgeson, the owner of the studio, asked me to come work with him. And well, I won't go into that, but he admired my work, whatever, and
Okay.
we thought together we're a better team than apart. Me being at one studio and him being at, because lots of times people would record at Studio A and then they'd mix it at RMJ with me, so we ended up deciding to work together.
Okay.
That's the short version. But so one day I was over at United and I'd been working at Studio A for maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. And I'd started learning some new techniques with the synclavier. I don't know, do you know what a synclavier is?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And
I'm not sure if my audience knows, so you can.
Okay, well, it was this. Basically what you do inside your Mac with Pro Tools, for a couple $1,000, you could do with a synclavier for $200,000.
Oh, yeah.
So we would record. So I started learning these techniques where we would record all these different tracks of vocals. This is before commission, in between working with commission. And I was doing this with a guy named Randy Jacobs from the Bone Shakers.
Okay.
And he also was in it's escaping me, but I'll think of it in a minute. Anyways, he was a great studio musician in Detroit, and he was working on his own records. And so we created all these techniques of recording background vocals, bouncing them into synclavier, and then bouncing them back to tape, and getting this really big sound. So back to United Sound. So I'm outside there, and they come out of the studio, and I'm coming in the studio to do something. And I say, "Hey guys, how you doing? What's up?" And they go, "Well, we're just checking out the studio. We're thinking about working here." But they weren't going to work with me. They were going to work with whoever was there, because that's the way people worked back then. They would just work at a studio, and engineers were, whoever's the best engineer at the studio will work with.
Right.
So then I said, "Hey, you guys should come over to Studio A. You got to check this out, what I'm doing now, because I think it's perfect for you. I'll show you some techniques we're doing with vocals." And Fred and Michael said, "Sure." And, this isn't verbatim. And Fred, if you're out there and you hear me or something, you kind of remember what happened. But right. So then they came over to the studio, and I showed them some stuff, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, this is exactly what we're looking for. That we want something like this where the vocals are big." So they decided to do their next album there, and we started from scratch and cut all the rhythm tracks, and then we moved on to vocals. And one thing about commission, which was really cool, and this is something everybody should learn, they recorded just the basic rhythm tracks. No frills, just drums, bass, piano, guitar. Maybe they'd add a Rhodes or something, or depending on how it was written, whatever, and maybe a guitar. And then they would do all the vocals. They did all the vocals. They did all the backgrounds. They did all the leads. They never put one overdub on until they finished the vocals. Then they would sit back and go, "Okay, there's a hole here. There's a hole here. We can fill that. Maybe. Yeah. Maybe we don't need to fill that hole." It was all about space, Yeah. And that's why those records were so much fun, because there's a lot of space. And it's all about the vocals. The vocals and the rhythm.
Absolutely.
So I learned the rhythm from funk. I learned how to record the rhythm recording funk. They played it, Michael Williams, great drummer. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Absolutely. I love Michael. I still love him. He's an engineer now.
He is.
He's amazing.
Absolutely.
And his hi-hat technique is the thing that always blew me away, because nobody ever did it. Only people that did it, what he did, was the drummer in the Yellow Jackets, and whoever was the drummer at the time for Sting. And I would hear him do these things, and I go, "Nobody does that. That is so cool." And it was just
Michael
a treat.
Williams.
It was a treat, man, to hear that stuff. And I always went, that's another bit of space that's happening. He'd only fill it when it had to be filled.
Right.
But it was good.
Man, those albums were special. I grew up, of course, being part of the family, always being close to commission, but I was just the biggest fan as anyone else. And I remember as a little kid going up to Studio A and seeing him record. I'm assuming you were in the room. So, but I was a little boy at the time.
Right. So you don't remember.
Right. I don't remember for sure.
You were probably like, who's that old man behind the console? I was 32 years old.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, man. But that was just a special time in music, but really in Detroit too. So many amazing artists across so many genres. Who are some other artists in Detroit that you work with in that time, like the late 70s going to like the 80s?
Oh, gosh. Well, for rock music, it was Mitch Ryder. Worked with Mitch Ryder, which was really, that was another epiphany about recording rock music, which I applied to gospel music eventually. You know, just the way we recorded drums and guitars and things, and learning how to build a track from scratch and make it sound fuller by just the way you approached recording guitars and drums and bass, even, you know, not just possibly going direct, using amplifiers too, you know, for the bass, even. Of course, for guitars, you use amps, but
Right.
Boy, as far as all the different artists, you know, Roger Troutman was one, you know, that was an amazing experience. What an incredible talent.
Wow.
And all the people that were around him. He was an incredible guitar player. He could play, you know, keyboards. He could play drums. He could play anything. When I had the opportunity to work with Sly Stone, that was kind of crazy, but wow. It was amazing. It was an amazing yet frustrating experience, only because of the drugs that he did. Okay. But as a talent, it was unbelievable to watch someone who could just go from playing a keyboard part to picking up a guitar and playing another part, and then running out to play the drums, come back in and play the bass, and then put a synth bass on, all in like really fast. Like you had to work really fast. So it made you understand how you can never let technology get in the way of creativity, you know, because some people will spend so much time fooling around with a microphone or something and that the creativity is lost. And
absolutely,
of course, today most people record at home, so they have the time to do both. They can be creative, and once they have their setup set up, then they can be super creative because they have their setup for their drums, set up for their bass or whatever. But back then you had to work fast because people, they have an idea, they want to get it out now, and you had to get that on tape fast.
Yeah.
So that, working with Sly, even though it was frustrating seeing him, you know, smoke crack cocaine constantly, that part was sad, but still you could see the amazing talent that he had and how creative he was, and that taught me certain things. He even showed me stuff on the board that was crazy. He's going, "Hey, watch this," and he'd take the faders and go, "Pull these down and go like this," and he'd start moving around like this. I go, "Wow, yeah." He goes, "Watch, I'll just drop this out and I'll bring it back in."
Wow.
And he realized, oh, maybe that's how those records were made, those Sly Stone records that were made early on. He was actually in the studio and saying, "No, turn that off, turn it on now," you know, like, because there's abrupt changes in some of those records, you know, and he learned that from some other engineers too back in LA when he was recording in LA.
Yeah.
So that was a great experience.
Man, so what was the transition for you into being, I know you're not exclusively gospel, of course, but you've made a lot of gospel albums. So
we did the whole commission thing. Then I moved to Nashville.
Okay.
And so then I moved to Nashville, and every time it was like, back then, you know, the way it worked, you know, it's not like today where you could possibly work on multiple things at the same time. You had to, when you were working on a project, you stayed in a studio for a couple of weeks, you know, like it's, at this point, I'm just mainly mixing most of the time. And so when you're working on a project, you can't really break away and do something else. And one of the things was that Fred would call and say, "Hey, I'm doing this record. Can you do?" And well, I'm booked already, and he had to get it out. So then he started working with Raymond, which was great, you know, because Raymond would be in the studio with me, and he learned, you know, how to record by watching me and Randy Poole at Studio A and Eric Morgerson. So by then he was in good hands. He had Ray. So
Yeah.
and I was in Nashville, and so I started recording. I was doing some gospel, but I was doing contemporary Christian music, like the group For Him and a bunch of other groups. And then I started doing country music too. And I worked with John Michael Montgomery and Billy Ray Cyrus, and we did all this whole country thing. And then there was one period where, and this is where my funk background came in. We did 45 dance remixes of country tunes for all these different artists. It was over a 2 or 3 year period, but we did, for almost every country artist that was out at that time. 45 different artists, 45 different songs over about 2 or 3 years. Where I would go in the studio with this guy named Steve Keller, and he would. Before it ever got to me, he would go in the studio and he'd get the multi-tracks and he'd pull off all the vocals and all the pertinent parts that he needed to make a dance remix. And then this is back before Pro Tools, and he had to load all these vocals and things into samplers. And then he would program new drums and all that. And then when it was finally finished, when he got it to where he could work on it, finish it, or almost finish it, then he'd take it to a recording studio. I'd show up. We'd print all this stuff out to 32 track and 48 track digital tape machines. And then it would take all day to print it. And then
I bet.
And then he'd go, oh, we need to overdub this other guitar part because that other guitar part doesn't work anymore because they didn't play to a click or something, and now it's out of time. So then we record some parts, and then we'd start mixing about 6 or 7 at night, and we'd finish the next morning at 10 a.m.
Wow.
We'd start at 10 a.m. and we'd finish at 10 a.m. But we had to get one song out because there wasn't a big enough budget, even though the record companies were making money hand over foot. But there wasn't a big enough budget to pay for more than 1 day of studio time and 1 day for an engineer. So we made all these records, and they were usually used for the clubs all across the country that did country dance mixing, and for the videos, like Tim McGraw's video, The Indian Outlaw, that they ended up using our dance remix for that.
Oh, wow.
And so it was more of a way for the record companies to promote the records in another way to get people to buy the original versions, And it was fun. It was really fun. It was tiring but fun, but we got the job done. And so that was between that and doing some conventional country records, that was my whole country period. And then I would still every now and then do some records, gospel records for different artists. And there was a guy named Sanchez Harley who
Sanchez
got a gig to do a Kirk Franklin record. And so now it's 2001. So this whole country period and whatever stuff I was doing went from 1992 to 2001. And he said, yeah, we're going to go to LA and mix this Kirk Franklin record I just cut. And so I went, okay, sure. And we went to Los Angeles to Gospel Centric Studios, and we recorded a record called The Rebirth by Kirk Franklin.
Oh, man.
And
that's amazing.
Or mixed it
right there.
We mixed it. And Kirk and I just became really good friends after that. And there's some great, good stuff going on. We just had a great time together. He's one of the funniest men I know and one of the most exciting people I know. Like, he's just always full of energy and ready to go. And he's just an amazing dude. I love him. And so we made that record, and then we continued making records for the last 20 some years,
Man, that's incredible. Like, I looked at your credits. I looked at all the different gospel artists you've worked with, and you've worked with all the top artists and all the other ones in between. Is there anyone that you haven't worked with that you would like to work with?
Well, for the longest time, I always wanted to work with Yolanda Adams. And
Oh yeah.
Fortunately, I just had the opportunity, but it's just for a one-off that Anthony Evans produced, and that was amazing. But it would have been great. I would have loved to have done a whole record with her. It would have been amazing. But we got to do one song, and that the experience of hearing her voice was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean that would be somebody for sure. There's probably other people, but I'm not good with remembering everybody's names. Some of the, but that's definitely somebody I would love. And I want to make a record with Fred again too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That would
We
be
need to make a
incredible.
record together.
You talked about Ray Hammond, and Ray is actually who taught me. I learned everything about the studio from Ray.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so I'm kind of off of your learning tree as well.
That's awesome.
Ray Hammond. So
that's great. Great.
Yeah, you're like my engineering grandfather. So this is definitely a treat.
Yeah, I have somebody like that too in my past too, where I learned it was a rock thing. There's an engineer named Ron Christopher, and he was the nephew of an engineer, or he was a nephew of an engineer / drummer who played for Ted Nugent, but he became an engineer, and he learned everything from Eddie Kramer. I don't know if you know Eddie Kramer. He's the guy that recorded like and mixed Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix. He started Electric Lady Studios in New York City.
Oh wow!
All that.
Yeah.
And he taught the guy from Ted Nugent, and his name is escaping me, but he taught, and then that guy taught Ron Christopher. Ron Christopher taught me how to record rock drums. And I always think of that. Eddie Kramer is my great-great-grandfather.
That's cool.
So it's the same kind of deal. Yeah, there's always mentors, and you always, you always want to give, knowledge to people. I don't, anybody can ask me a question. If I'll always give them the information. There's nothing to hide.
Yeah.
I mean, I can give you all the tools. I can give you all the ideas, and then you've got to do it.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't mind telling anybody there's no secrets.
Yeah.
There's no secrets.
Yeah. Speaking of that, can you talk a little bit about your mixing and recording courses that you have on Gospel Producers?
Yeah, that was fun. That was an interesting thing, the way it came about. It was totally by chance, kind of like seeing Fred and Michael outside of Studio A.
Yeah.
We were I was in my studio in Nashville. It must have been about 2016 or 15 or something. And we were printing mixes. I think Adam was printing mixes, Adam David Smith, who works for me. I don't know why, but for some reason something came up on Facebook, and it was John Mike in a recording studio somewhere in Tennessee, and he was like doing a live thing, like it was almost like a class. And I was watching it, and I'm going, this is pretty cool, but he's going about it the wrong way. Like maybe we can maybe I need to talk to this guy, because maybe we could do something together, So I chimed in and said, "Hey, you're doing a great thing here. We need to talk or something. This is great that you're showing all this information on recording on Facebook. Yeah. I think it was on Facebook, yeah." And so, but it took about 6 months to a year for us to get together, and we just started talking it over. And we were originally going to do the whole thing live, and we realized, no, there's no way you can just do it live. We gotta go in, and it's going to take 2 or 3 days, of just filming and whatever. And we decided to start the process from the actual recording of drums and bass and guitars and keyboards, and how to mic them, then how to do the choir or background vocal overdubs, and then the lead vocals, and the different signal paths to do it. And that's how it all came about. It was just about by chance, me seeing John Mike one time and then pursuing it. And I wasn't even sure I even wanted to do it until he convinced me. I just wanted to tell. At first I was just like, hey, I got an idea. Maybe you could do this. You know, it might make your whole presentation better. And they said, no, you're going to do it. You're going to do it with me. And so we just did it. And then that led to doing the Yosh Drum Warehouse too. You know, because I just wanted to do something where people could get, you know, if they needed to fix a snare or fix a kick or whatever, or they wanted to program new drums or whatever, they could get really good sounds. And so that's why we started that. We got Kevin Kelly to go in there and beat on the drums and show us all of his different drums. I don't know if you know Kelly, but he's amazing, man. He has, like, I think it's at least 32, maybe more. Kevin, if I'm out there and I'm wrong, just, you know, chime in sometime. But he has 32 kits, and he has a million snares, and so we just got the best of the best, and we went into Randy Poole's studio and started recording, and we made Drumhouse 1 and 2, and there'll be a 3 eventually. We're going to get to it. We've got some other things coming up too. John, Mike, and I have some other things that will be coming up. Maybe some plugins or something eventually.
Nice. I'll be looking out for it.
We've all been going through some personal things with his parents and stuff, or, you know, his father's really ill, and but now I don't know if you know, but I moved to North Carolina, so we're closer. So eventually, when all this other personal stuff takes care of itself, we're going to get together and create some new things.
Very nice. Well, I definitely appreciate the Drum Warehouse. I use it all the time. All the time.
I wanted to tell you something. I said something about my wife, and I wanted to tell you how much of a family affair, to take a quote from Sly Stone, it was working with Commission. Back in the day, of course, we would, you know, not only work together in the studio, we ate together in the studio. We ate a lot of fast food and things like that. But one day, my wife, she'd gotten this recipe. It's for a friendship cake. It's called a friendship cake, and it was one of these cakes where you pass the batter, like almost like sourdough bread. You pass the batter on from one person to another, and then you have to let it sit, and you put all the stuff in it, and it grows, and then you make it into this cake and you bake it. Anyways, she brings it to the studio, and everyone was starving that day. No one had eaten any lunch or anything. And the whole, she pulled out the cake and everyone's looking at it, you know, and I'm like, I know it's probably going to be good. But the guys were like a little weary. They were looking at it like, what is this, a friendship cake? You know? And so I took out a little piece and I gave it to Fred and to Michael, and they started eating it. And they went, oh my gosh. And then the whole group, it was gone in 5 minutes. Once they tasted it, it was great. And it was just another one of those days where we all were just, you know, hanging out together and having a good time. And it made my wife feel really good because she was able to contribute to our fun that day. So it's a great memory that I'll always remember, hanging out with the guys. And it was always fun hanging out with Commission because they would always be there. Like the whole team would be there while I was even mixing, you know, even, not just recording. They'd be in the back of the room at studio. You probably remember that. If you were a little kid, you'd see them there.
Yeah.
And they would be talking just like we're talking right now while I'm mixing. And and after, sometimes I'd have to go, hey guys, 1 minute, I got to hear this quiet part. And then they'd stop and I'd listen. Okay, you can go back. And then I'd crank it back up again.
Yeah. Hey, look, stuff still is the same, man. Nothing's changed. It's still like that. You know, it's always a lot of fun in the studio. Fred and Ray, they always cultivate a pretty fun environment. And but you know, the work is there.
The work got done. And you know, I think back to the time, and I remember Fred and Michael Brooks and Michael Williams, us talking about, let's make a record that sounds really great, like that can because they were listening to like Sting records. They were listening to the Yellow Jackets. They were listening to all these, and we wanted to make a record as good as that, you know? I mean, I don't know if we achieved it, but we tried. And the thing was, is we wanted to to make good records to represent gospel music and not just, throw up a microphone and record a choir or whatever, because a lot of records other than Andre Crouch, they weren't very good back then. Thomas Whitfield, now he made good records. He was one of the innovators. Boy, that guy, that's a little side story. This is when I was working at RMJ, one of the engineers who actually worked with Thomas all the time couldn't work with him for like a week or two, so I worked with him, and I'll never forget him sitting down at the piano, and I remember I never really liked the sound of the piano when anyone else played it. I'd mic it a certain way, and I'd go, yeah, it sounds all right, but it doesn't sound great. As soon as he sat down and played, I went, oh my gosh, it sounds amazing.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it was like someone who had the dynamics and that sound, that feel, like it was just, the speakers just exploded. Like I went, oh my gosh, there's nothing wrong with the piano. It's the players.
Right.
And I also discovered that years later, there was another thing about recording that I realized that, we can do all we want with technology, and we can shape things or whatever, but there's certain things like that piano sound that it's all about the musician. It's about how they feel it. And the instrument has to be good, but it's how they feel it. And years later, during that same time period, I was listening to some tracks that were cut in Nashville, in the studio at RMJ Studios, and I kept listening to these acoustic guitars, and I thought, wow, how do they get that sound? It sounds amazing. And I would record acoustic guitar players in Detroit. I'd try all these different techniques, and it never sounded like that. And these were good guitar players, but they didn't really have the right acoustic guitar, and they didn't really know that Nashville thing. And so anyways, when I went to Nashville, and the first country recording session I did, the acoustic guitar player was Garth Brooks's guitar player, Chris Lusinger.
Oh, wow.
And I mic'd him up the same way as I mic'd up anybody I ever did in Detroit. And I was just like, oh God, I hope it sounds good. This is Garth Brooks's guitar player. And as soon as he played the first chord, I went, oh my gosh. That's it. It's the player. It's not just these microphones. These microphones are nothing. they capture it, but you got to be able to capture it. You got to know what you're doing. You got to capture it. But it's when that player he has a certain thing that goes on between his fingers and the picking technique and the instrument. There's nothing like it. And I found it time and time again, especially with singers too. There's just great singers, and then there's singers that are okay. And every now and then that one singer, you're like, what? I'm not doing anything different. Why does she or he sound so much better?
Yep.
And it's a certain innate talent that comes with certain people, and their work ethic too. I mean, they didn't get there. Yeah. They were born with a gift, but they developed it,
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Matt, you know what? That makes me want to ask you this. In your workflow now, what's the percentage of you actually recording to mixing?
It's 99.9% mixing now. Okay. Because I haven't tracked anything since, I think that Vachon record I did back in 2018. Okay. And then I did a couple of country things in 16 and also 18, where we actually went in the studio and recorded. So it's been a long time since I actually recorded. Anyway. Okay. But so now it's mostly mixing and just, but I have a team, I mix everything, but Adam, David Smith, and Clifton Graham, they set everything up for me. They work on the tracks and or create stems and things like that after the fact. And they're great guys, man. And so when I get a track, at least it's, it's cleaned up, so there's no noise and stuff in between parts and things like that. If there's hums and things, they try to remove everything. And all that sort of stuff. And they put it in a good order so I can actually sit down and start mixing and not deal with, oh my gosh, the vocals are really messed up here,
Yeah.
And in fact, like Cliff or Adam, if they run it, when they get the track and they find something, they go, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with these horns or this drum track. Like there's a bunch of edits that aren't correct. They'll call the artist or the producer and say, hey, can you send over the raw drum tracks? And I see what you're trying to do. We need to time align this, like you were trying to do, but there's clicks and pops in it, and then they'll fix it. And then it gets to me, and then I can just start mixing. Yeah. So and to answer your question, no, I haven't been tracking. I think, one other tracking I did. We were doing Tye Tribbett's last record. He wanted to punch in one word. And so we did that in my studio in Phoenix. I had a microphone. In fact, I couldn't even find a microphone stand. I stuck it on the end of a stand that was used for an iPhone. I taped it onto the stand. Wow. And he did the intro to one of his songs. It was great, though, because that's another thing about vocals. And Tye's the king of this, because it was what he was punching into was something that was originally a live record.
Yeah.
And he's the king of remembering what he felt like at the moment that he was doing the initial recording. And he gets into the frame of mind, and when it comes out, it's like you're at the concert. Like as if he was there that night, it comes back. Like it was amazing. That's happened to me twice with him. Over the years, where he punched in something years ago, back in 2008 in a studio, and I was just like, "Are you kidding me?" Because lots of people they'll do a live record and then they go punch in their vocal, and they don't really go back to where they were at the moment that they were doing that vocal, and they don't have the same energy, and they'll say that the microphone isn't right, or it's the EQ isn't. Well, no, partially that. It can, if you have the wrong microphone, sure, if you're not using the same microphone. But guys like Tye can just punch in a vocal, and it doesn't even matter what microphone. It doesn't matter how it's EQ'd or anything. It sounds just like it did the night. And I'm like, we weren't even using the same mic. And I put it in the track, and then you play the next line, and it was like, I didn't even do anything to it.
Hey, that goes back to your statement about it's about the talent, the person.
Exactly. Yeah. And you just got to capture it as fast as you can, because they're in that mindset, and you got to capture it. So even though I don't record, I still remember it all, and that's because I did 100 sessions with Bootsy Collins.
Exactly.
And that's one of the things for young people, it's like you got to record every day. Try to, and record drums every day, record whatever every day as much as you can, or switch off from drums to vocals to guitars to whatever, and to get good at it before you can even mix it, because you need to know what it sounds like before.
Yeah, that's great advice. So in your mix process, are you 100% in the box? Are you doing any hybrid mixing?
No hybrid mixing. I haven't hybrid mixed really anything since 2010. End of 2009, 2010. Everything's been in a box.
Very nice.
Don't tell anybody. Okay, don't tell anybody. It's like you could do that, and maybe there is some differences, but the way I came about doing it in the box was out of frustration, because, like I said, from the time I moved to Nashville until 2009, end of 2009, we went from studio to studio for each project. We hardly ever stayed at the same studios, because it was about the producer would like some studio, or the rate was better at this studio, or in the case of somebody like Kirk Franklin, he lived in Dallas, so we always went to the same studio there, and or we went to LA to do it. But what started happening in all the recording studios, all the professional recording studios with big consoles, is the maintenance started to the studios were poorly maintained,
Yeah.
And they tried to maintain them, but I mean, these consoles were at this point 20 years old, or older,
Yeah.
Depending on if it was an old SSL G series or E series, it could be 30 years old. So what was happening was you would get frustrated because you were using Pro Tools and you were stemming things out on the console, and then right in the middle of a mix, the left side of a piano would drop out, and you're like, "What happened? What just happened? What just happened?" And then you find it. You go, "I think it was the piano," and then you have to switch out modules. So you were constantly doing that. Every studio, it was like that, and so one day I came back home from one of these sessions, and I took the session and I put it in had it in Pro Tools, and I started mixing in the box. And I knew there were some new plugins out at the time that emulated analog. And so I started trying those, and I emulated a mix that I'd done on an SSL in the box. And I went, this sounds just as good as the mix I did. So we're gonna learn this, and we're gonna go here, because I'm not gonna deal with this anymore, unless somebody really wants to. If they really want to, I'll do it. I'll go to the studio. But generally speaking, we started getting good sounds because there were some new things that changed around that time, around 2009, 2010, that started emulating more analog-ish sounds, on the tubas and things like that. Things like PSP and Slate Digital eventually, and all those things, they started emulating analog and universal audio and all that. And these are really good plugins, and even Waves, they changed too. They got better. And so that's when I decided I'll start doing it, unless somebody really wants to go to a studio. And I think that's only happened. I think it actually happened one other time. We went into a studio after that point. But the rest of the time it's been in the box.
Awesome. Well, that's encouraging to hear, because a lot of people want to get into this and they don't have the budget to buy a lot of outboard gear. Sure. So that's encouraging.
I always thought that way. Even when I first started out, even though I had the availability of a recording studio, I never wanted to buy a lot of gear because I saw the debt that people accrued with building recording studios and then not getting enough in return. Like for the longest time, I didn't even own a microphone or speakers, until I had to go independent, and then I bought speakers, then I bought this, and I bought this microphone for this or whatever, and then I bought some preamps and things like that. But you never wanted to go completely into debt because, especially when you have a family, you can't, you want to make money for your family, but you also don't want to go bankrupt doing it.
Absolutely.
So, if you can jump in doing the least amount investment, always try that first, just make sure you're buying the best things you can buy for the price and start your career.
Do you have any interest in mixing in Dolby Atmos?
Good question. Yes and no. Right now, no. It's a huge investment. I don't know if I even have the patience for it right now. I'm getting a little old. It's a whole new technology. I don't want to be completely left behind. If I have to, I'll go there. Right now I'm not going there. And in the meantime, what's happening is most of the Dolby Atmos stuff is being done off of my stem. So I feel like I'm doing it anyways. Right. So whenever you hear a record that's a gospel record that's in Atmos, it mostly happened by my stems. And the engineer pretty much, they started at 0 and then they moved things around and made it wider and whatever and did their thing. And they've done a really great job at doing that. But the good thing is that all the hard stuff, like writing the vocals and writing this guitar and writing, that's all done for them. So they can just like me concentrating on the mix, they can concentrate on the surround mix.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Maybe, I never say never, so it could happen, but I not right now. I'm not going to do it.
Okay. All
I
right.
know I'm one of my closest friends, John Blass, is doing it, and I appreciate it. I'm glad that he's doing
Yeah.
it.
Absolutely. No, it's good to know people that's doing it.
Yeah.
So, John, can you walk us through some of the projects that you got going on right now?
Yeah. You're going to be hearing some new stuff. We just finished up in the last 2 or 3 weeks from Tye Tribbett. I got some Tamala Man coming up. I mean, we're finished with it. That should be coming out soon. Israel Houghton did a couple tracks for him. Kenny Lewis. Going to work with Mano again. We're doing a song for Karen Clark Sherrard.
Nice.
Nice.
There's a couple other artists, Lisa Noel Smith and Summer Pearson, a guy named Marquis Dolford, and I think that's about it this week. That's the last 2 or 3 weeks. Actually, it's been about two or 3 weeks we've been doing all that. I've been doing all that every day. We're finally, they're off to mastering. All that stuff's off to mastering, so it should be coming out. They're all one-off songs. Oh, and then the song for Anthony Evans too, that I mentioned earlier.
Oh, nice. Very nice. Man, that's an amazing group of artists right there.
Yeah, that was the one with Yolanda Adams that I'm looking forward to too. That's that song that I just remembered. That song is actually going to be in a television series coming out in 2025. Kevin Costner show.
Nice.
Anthony Evans produced the track.
Oh, wow.
And it's, yeah. I wish I knew let me see if I can find the name of it. I don't know if I wrote it down anywhere. Let me see. Yeah, it's
yeah, Anthony, he's a talent.
Oh gosh, that guy can sing. What a great guy to produce an artist too, because he's a great singer and she's a great singer.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up here, John. I appreciate your time, but before we go, I want you to just give out some advice to anybody who wants to work in this industry, who wants to be an engineer, wants to learn in this climate that we're in now. Just speak to those people and give them anything that you want to say.
Well, always have friendship cake at your sessions. No, I guess, learn. Obviously, you have to learn the most about the process of recording, not just going to YouTube videos. You have to do it on your own. You can start with that, or you can start with my class, or you can start with someone else's class. It doesn't matter, and read as much as you can about the process. And I've said this before, you got to record drums and bass and all this stuff every day just to get to that point so you understand what these instruments sound like and get used to recording and trying all the different methods of recording. Because at some point you're going to get the opportunity to do it for the person that's going to make or break you, right? And you've got to be ready for it, obviously. So you got to try to get somehow you have to try to get your 10,000 hours in before that opportunity presents itself, or, at least get close to it. And so once you get that opportunity and you're fairly successful at getting past that opportunity or doing a good job, always be congenial and respectful of your clients as much as possible, because you can be the greatest engineer, or at least think you are, or greatest mixer, greatest tracking engineer, whatever, but if you're a jerk, no one's going to come back to you.
Exactly.
It'll get you. I've seen it happen with other people, and then they don't work. So you have to do that. And then always remember, as an engineer, it's not your record. It's not your project. It's the producer's and the artist's project. And your job is to facilitate their vision. It's like you just have to, it's not your record. You can put all of you in there, but ultimately it's their record. And whatever their vision is, you try to get there. And and always try what they ask for, even if it doesn't work, because they'll know if it doesn't work. Like it's easier to try something than it is to argue about it. So just argue with yourself. Don't argue with the producer or the artist. Just try to go there and make it sound like they want it to sound, because they have a vision, and in their ears they have a vision of what it's supposed to be. And you're just trying to facilitate that. I've said that too many times, but that's what it is. So, if you can do that, then you'll work for a long time. You'll work until your hair goes gray.
I don't know if I have that luxury. Yeah.
Well, maybe your beard.
Yeah, the beard. Well, John, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your gift. You have been really a mainstay in this industry, and you're just a treasure, really. So thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you, and it's my pleasure, and it's been really fun, and I'll keep doing it as long as I can, okay?
Absolutely.
All right.
Well, everyone, thank you guys for joining us today for this episode. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do so. Please download the episodes on Apple Podcasts, and we're going to keep doing great content for you guys. Again, thank y'all for coming, and we'll see y'all next time. Peace.
Peace.